He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Block every man you've ever talked to." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I unlocked my phone, blocked every man he pointed at, handed it back, and watched the tension disappear from his face almost instantly. 6 hours later, while he slept beside me, his own phone lit up 3 times in less than a minute. When I finally unlocked it, every accusation he'd thrown at me suddenly made sense. Nothing about the man sleeping beside me was who I thought he was. His only explanation would later be 5 words. "That's different. You don't understand." He was right about one thing. I didn't understand. Not then. But by sunrise, I would understand him better than anyone ever had. My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and until that Tuesday night, I genuinely believed I was going to spend the rest of my life with Ethan Brooks. Looking back now, I don't think our relationship collapsed in one night. It didn't fall apart overnight. It unraveled one small compromise at a time. Every time I convinced myself it's not a big deal, I quietly gave away another piece of who I was. The truth is, nothing about Ethan seemed dangerous when we first met. He wasn't loud, he wasn't arrogant, he wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention every time he walked into a room. He had this calm, thoughtful energy that made people feel comfortable around him. He remembered little things I'd casually mentioned weeks earlier. He always asked whether I'd gotten home safely. He opened doors without making a performance out of it. After dating enough emotionally unavailable men, his consistency felt refreshing. The first warning sign was easy to explain away. The second took a little more effort. After that, I stopped counting because every excuse sounded just reasonable enough to believe. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd slowly rearranged my entire life around keeping him comfortable. We'd been together for just over 2 years. For the last 11 months, Ethan had been living in my condo, the one I'd bought years before we ever met. It wasn't huge, but I'd worked hard for it. Every room held a memory from a version of myself that had existed before relationships became so exhausting. At first, living together felt surprisingly easy. We divided chores without arguing. He cooked breakfast on weekends. I'd make dinner during the week. It wasn't exciting, and honestly, that's what I loved most about it. Our days settled into a quiet rhythm that felt safe. Looking back now, I realize I mistook comfort for security. If someone had asked me to describe us back then, I would have said we were peaceful, stable, happy. Back then, I thought our quiet evenings meant everything was fine. What I didn't realize was that silence can also mean nobody is saying the thing that's slowly destroying the relationship. Ethan's jealousy didn't arrive all at once. It crept into our relationship so slowly that I kept finding excuses for it. The first time he asked who had texted me, I thought it was sweet. The 10th time, I told myself he was just insecure because his ex-girlfriend had cheated on him. The 50th time, I had stopped noticing. Before long, the questions became part of my everyday routine. Who texted? Why was he reacting to my photo? How long had I known him? Why did he need to message me at all? It didn't matter who the man was. Ethan always found a reason to be uncomfortable. He never yelled. That almost made it worse. Instead, he asked every question so calmly that I usually ended up doubting myself instead of him. Somehow, that made it even harder to push back, because every disagreement left me feeling like I was the unreasonable one. Meanwhile, his own phone might as well have been protected by national security. It was always face down. Always. Coffee table. Kitchen counter. Nightstand, even when charging. If a notification appeared while we were watching television, he'd casually flip the phone over before reading it. If I reached across the table to grab the salt and accidentally brushed against it, he'd instinctively slide it closer to himself before continuing the conversation like nothing had happened. Once, I picked it up because someone was calling while he was in the shower. He rushed out with shampoo still in his hair. "I'll get it." His reaction surprised me enough that I apologized. He kissed my forehead afterward and told me he wasn't upset. He just valued privacy. At the time, that sounded perfectly reasonable. Back then, I honestly thought Ethan just valued privacy. It never crossed my mind that there was a difference between wanting space and hiding an entirely different life. The argument that changed everything started over something so ordinary that I almost laugh when I think about it now. Almost. It was a Tuesday evening. I was curled up on the couch with my phone, messaging my cousin Nathan about my aunt's upcoming 60th birthday. Nathan and I had volunteered to organize the surprise party together. We'd been sending ridiculous gift ideas back and forth for nearly 20 minutes. A karaoke machine, a hot air balloon ride, matching sweaters for the entire family. None of them were serious. Most of them were terrible. I laughed at one of his messages. Across the room, Ethan looked up from his laptop. "What's so funny?" "My cousin." He nodded once, then asked, "Nathan?" "Yeah. You've been texting him a lot lately. We're planning Aunt Melissa's birthday." "I know." He closed his laptop with an unusually deliberate motion. The soft click echoed through the room. "You know," he began carefully. Sometimes I wonder if you realize how that looks. I frowned. How what looks? You spending so much time talking to other men. For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I smiled. He didn't. Ethan, it's just something I've been thinking about. Nathan is my cousin. I know what he is. Then why are we having this conversation? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because lately it isn't just Nathan. I blinked. What do you mean? There's your old coworker. We exchange work references maybe twice a year. The trainer at your gym. He literally says hello to everyone. That guy from college. He's married with 3 kids. He kept naming men one after another as though simply existing in my life somehow made them suspicious. By that point, it wasn't really about any of them anymore. It was about proving that no explanation I gave would ever be enough. Ethan sighed like I was deliberately missing the point. You always have an explanation. I have explanations because there's nothing inappropriate happening. For a second, I honestly wondered whether he'd hurt himself. I'm saying men don't always think the way women think. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, I made the mistake I'd made dozens of times before. I tried to reassure him. I moved closer and took his hand. Ethan! He didn't squeeze mine back. I love you. I know. I've never given you a reason to doubt me. I know. So why does this keep happening? He looked down at our hands before quietly pulling his away. Because someday, he swallowed, someone is going to take you away from me. The sadness in his voice caught me off guard. For a brief moment, I saw not an accusing boyfriend, but a frightened little boy desperately trying not to lose someone he loved. I wrapped my arms around him. No one is taking me anywhere. You don't know that. I do. What if one day one of those men says exactly the right thing? I'd still choose you. He shook his head. You can't promise that. I just did. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me again. If that's true. My stomach tightened. Yeah, prove it. There it was. The sentence that quietly divided my life into before and after. What do you mean? I want you to block them. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I honestly couldn't believe he'd said it out loud. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You want me to block who exactly? Every man you've ever talked to. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped. His fingers tightened around the edge of the dresser, like he was buying himself a few more seconds before saying something he knew I wouldn't believe. I mean all of them. For a second, I honestly couldn't tell whether he expected me to agree with him. My cousin? Yes. My coworkers? Yes. My college friends? Yes. The trainer who says good morning? If he isn't important, blocking him shouldn't matter. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ethan, this isn't normal. His expression immediately changed. The hurt appeared so quickly, it almost looked rehearsed. I knew you'd say that. Because it isn't normal. No. He stood up. Because choosing me is apparently too much to ask. That isn't what this is. Then what is it? You want me to cut perfectly innocent people out of my life. I want you to choose our relationship. I already did. Not completely. The argument stretched on for almost half an hour. Every explanation I offered somehow became evidence against me. If I defended my cousin, it proved I cared too much about another man. If I defended my coworkers, it meant I valued their feelings over Ethan's. Every road somehow led back to me being the problem. Then something changed. The frustration slowly drained out of his face. He looked exhausted. For the first time that night, he stopped arguing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I can't keep feeling like I'm competing with everyone. Tears filled his eyes. I just want to know I'm enough. The sight broke something inside me. Because I loved him. Because I believed him. Because manipulation wrapped in vulnerability is incredibly difficult to recognize while you're standing inside it. I closed my eyes, then quietly unlocked my phone. One by one. Nathan. Blocked. My old coworker. Blocked. College friends. Blocked. Gym contacts. Blocked. Every innocent conversation disappeared behind a black screen because the man I loved convinced me it was the price of keeping us together. When I finally handed him my phone, he looked through every blocked contact himself. He smiled quietly. Not with relief. Not with gratitude. It was the expression of someone who had finally gotten exactly what he wanted. For reasons I couldn't explain at the time, that smile unsettled me far more than the argument itself. He kissed my forehead. I knew you'd choose us. I forced myself to smile back. But something inside me felt strangely empty. I didn't know it then, but I'd just taken the final step into a trap that had never really been about trust. It had always been about control. Around 2 o'clock that night, I woke up thirsty. The apartment was completely silent. Moonlight spilled across the bedroom floor in pale silver lines. Ethan was asleep beside me, one arm stretched across the mattress. His breathing slow, steady, peaceful. I slipped out of bed, padded into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there for a moment staring through the living room windows at the city lights below. I remember thinking how strangely quiet everything felt after such an exhausting evening. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe we'd finally move past this. Maybe a vibration interrupted the thought. Then another, then another. Rapid, insistent, coming from the bedroom. I walked back inside. Ethan never even stirred. His phone, as always, lay face down on the nightstand. The screen continued glowing with new notifications underneath. I stood there staring at it for several long seconds. I could still hear his voice from earlier. If you loved me. Then I looked at the list of blocked contacts still open on my own phone. My cousin. My friends. People who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Slowly, very slowly, I reached toward Ethan's phone. For a long moment, my hand hovered over Ethan's phone without actually touching it. It sounds ridiculous now, considering what I was about to find, but I genuinely felt guilty. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that trust mattered more than curiosity. If you reached the point where you needed to search someone's phone, maybe the relationship had already failed. That was the kind of person I had always tried to be. The kind who asked questions instead of making accusations. The kind who gave people the benefit of the doubt. The kind who believed love worked better when it wasn't constantly looking for proof. But as I stood there in the moonlit bedroom, another thought kept pushing its way to the front of my mind. Just a few hours earlier, Ethan had watched me erase half the men from my life because he insisted that was what loyalty looked like. He had looked relieved when I blocked my own cousin. He had smiled. Not because we had solved anything, because I had surrendered. The phone buzzed again. I looked at Ethan. He didn't move. His face looked almost peaceful in his sleep. Completely different from the man who had spent 30 minutes convincing me that talking to male relatives somehow threatened our relationship. I slowly picked up the phone. The screen lit up in my hand. Thankfully, he hadn't changed the passcode. Months ago, he'd entered it into my phone for emergencies. It had always seemed like a strange contradiction. He claimed I could unlock it any time, but every single time I got anywhere near it, he reacted as though I had crossed an invisible line. Back then, I convinced myself that everyone had little quirks. Tonight, I wasn't so sure anymore. I entered the code. The screen unlocked immediately. Nothing unusual appeared at first. The home screen looked exactly the way I'd seen it hundreds of times before. A weather widget, a photo of us at the beach, several unopened emails. For one irrational second, I actually felt embarrassed. Maybe I had been unfair. Maybe those late-night notifications really were from work. Maybe tomorrow morning I would confess that I'd checked his phone, apologize for doubting him, and we'd somehow laugh about how paranoid we'd both become. Then another notification slid across the top of the screen. Emily, I still can't stop smiling about tonight. My stomach tightened. I opened Instagram. Emily's conversation appeared first. There was no confusion about what I was looking at. No innocent misunderstanding. No awkward joke taken out of context. Their messages flowed with the easy familiarity of two people who had been emotionally involved for quite a while. Good morning, handsome. Morning, beautiful. Sleep okay? Barely. I kept thinking about you. Guess we'll have to fix that soon. My fingers stopped moving. I reread the conversation once. Then again. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe Emily didn't know he had a girlfriend. Maybe Ethan had been trying to shut it down politely. I scrolled upward. Instead of finding distance, I found enthusiasm. He complimented her hair. He asked for selfies. He teased her about stealing his hoodie. He sent voice notes. There wasn't a single message that suggested he wanted the conversation to end. I backed out and opened another chat. Nicole. Different woman. Exactly the same version of Ethan. He was charming. Funny. Attentive. Every response came within minutes. Every compliment sounded effortless. I kept scrolling. Rachel. Then Hannah. Then Olivia. Then Brooke. Each conversation felt like stepping into another relationship. It wasn't simply flirting. He remembered birthdays. He asked about work presentations. He comforted them after bad days. He wished them luck before job interviews. He celebrated promotions. He even reminded one woman to take medication before bed because she'd mentioned having migraines a few weeks earlier. Those weren't casual conversations. They required time, attention, emotional investment, things I believed belonged to us. The realization hit me harder than the flirting itself. I'd spent months wondering why Ethan sometimes seemed distracted when we were having dinner together. Why he'd occasionally smile at his phone and then lock the screen before I could glance over. Why he often said he was mentally exhausted after work. Now I knew. He wasn't investing his energy in one relationship. He was maintaining dozens. I opened Messenger. More women. Facebook. More women. WhatsApp. More women. After the first dozen conversations, I stopped reading names. I started counting instead. 20. 30. 40. When I finally reached 47, I lowered the phone. I couldn't make myself keep going. The number almost felt absurd. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my knees suddenly didn't trust me anymore. My mind kept replaying the argument from earlier. Block every man you've ever talked to. The hypocrisy was almost too enormous to process. But then I found the conversation that made everything else fade into the background. Her name was Ava. Unlike the others, there were no long gaps between messages. They talked every day. Morning, afternoon, late at night. Sometimes only minutes apart. Their conversation didn't feel like flirting. It felt like a relationship. The most recent messages were only a few hours old. Ava, I already miss you. Ethan, me too. Ava, tonight was worth waiting for. Ethan, Thursday will be even better. Thursday. I stared at the word. Today was Tuesday. No, technically Wednesday now. I scrolled upward. Photos of restaurant menus, pictures of wine glasses, a selfie of 2 coffee cups sitting across from each other. No faces. Just enough to preserve plausible deniability. Then I reached Monday evening. My heartbeat slowed in the strangest way, almost as if my body already knew what I was about to read. Monday was the night Ethan had texted me saying he'd been stuck at work because an inventory meeting had run late. I remembered the message perfectly. Don't wait up. Probably another couple of hours. I'd answered immediately. Drive safely, I'll keep dinner warm. I smiled sadly as I remembered reheating his food twice because I didn't want him eating a cold meal after such a long day. I continued scrolling. At exactly the same time he'd supposedly been sitting in a meeting, he'd sent Ava this. Finally here. A few minutes later. You look incredible. Then, I've been looking forward to this all week. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't make myself breathe normally. He hadn't worked late. Not once. He'd simply been somewhere else. With someone else. And while I was worrying whether his dinner would get cold, he was choosing wine with another woman. I opened the photos they'd exchanged afterward. Nothing explicit. Nothing that crossed into obvious proof of physical intimacy. They didn't need to. The smiles. The closeness. The private jokes. The anticipation for Thursday. Those things said everything. I placed one hand over my mouth. Not because I was about to cry. Because I was afraid I might wake him. Oddly enough, I wasn't angry yet. Anger usually arrives quickly. This felt different. It felt like watching a puzzle slowly assemble itself into a picture you never wanted to see. Every strange excuse, every unexplained late night, every moment he'd accused me of giving too much attention to another man. Every conversation that somehow ended with me apologizing. Every accusation, every guilt trip, every demand. They suddenly fit together with terrifying precision. Control had never been about protecting our relationship. I sat there staring at the floor. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd felt completely relaxed around him. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped feeling like his partner and started feeling like I was constantly being evaluated. It had been about protecting his lies. If I was constantly defending myself, I wouldn't have time to question him. If I felt guilty, I wouldn't notice his secrets. If I cut every decent man out of my life, I'd become more dependent on the one man quietly betraying me. That realization hurt more than the cheating itself, because cheating destroys trust. Manipulation makes you question your own judgment. And once that happens, you stop recognizing yourself. I looked over at Ethan sleeping peacefully beside me. The man I'd spent 2 years defending. The man I'd just sacrificed friendships for. The man who insisted that loyalty meant isolation. I realized something then. When someone asks you to shrink your world so they'll feel secure, it usually isn't because they're afraid you'll leave. It's because they're hoping you'll never notice they're already halfway out the door. I locked his phone, set it gently back on the nightstand, then stared at him for another few seconds. There was no point waiting until morning. Some conversations don't become easier with sleep. I reached over, rested my hand lightly on his shoulder, and shook him once. Ethan. He frowned without opening his eyes. Ethan. This time my voice was steady. We need to talk. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, squinting at me through the darkness. For a second, he looked completely disoriented, like he'd forgotten where he was. Then he glanced at the clock on the nightstand. Clara, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Do you know what time it is? I do. What happened? Are you okay? There was genuine concern in his voice, and under different circumstances, it probably would have comforted me. Instead, it made my chest ache. I wondered how many women had heard that same gentle voice after he'd spent the evening lying to someone else. I stood beside the bed without answering. His eyes finally settled on the phone in my hand. Everything changed. The sleep disappeared from his face so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw locked. What are you doing with my phone? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw it at him. I simply asked the question that had been sitting in my chest ever since I read Ava's messages. Who is she? He frowned. Who? Ava. For a heartbeat, he just stared at me. Then his expression shifted again. Not guilt. Not shame. Calculation. I don't know what you're talking about. I looked down at the phone and unlocked it. You might want to think about that answer before I open the conversation again. His eyes followed every movement of my thumb. He knew exactly which conversation I meant. Clara. His voice softened. Give me my phone. I will. I met his eyes. Right after you tell me who Ava is. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. We're not doing this. We already are. You went through my private messages. I did. I can't believe you'd invade my privacy like that. There it was. Not an apology. Not even an attempt to explain. The very first thing he cared about was the fact that I'd looked. I felt strangely calm. I can. What? I can believe I looked. He blinked. You spent 30 minutes tonight making me block my own cousin because you said talking to another man crossed a line. I held the phone up between us. Meanwhile, you've been telling another woman you couldn't stop thinking about her. His face hardened. You're twisting things. I haven't twisted a single word. You don't understand the context. Then explain it. It's complicated. No. I shook my head. It isn't. Silence settled between us. Outside, somewhere below the condo, a car rolled slowly through the empty street. Inside our bedroom, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Finally, Ethan sighed. Ava is a friend. I actually smiled. Not because I believed him. Because I'd expected him to say exactly that. A friend. Yes. The kind of friend you tell you miss? He hesitated. We're close. The kind of friend you have dinner with while telling your girlfriend you're stuck at work? His mouth opened, then closed again. The kind of friend you make plans to see on Thursday? His shoulders dropped ever so slightly. You read everything. I read enough. He ran a hand through his hair and began pacing across the room. This is why I don't like people touching my phone. I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, even after everything. He was still talking as though the problem was my behavior. Ethan, he stopped walking. Did you sleep with her? He looked away. Answer me. It's not that simple. My heart sank. People who have nothing to hide almost never answer simple questions with complicated sentences. I asked you something very straightforward. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't want to say something while we're emotional. I let out a quiet laugh. We're emotional because you've been lying to me. I haven't lied. You told me you were working Monday night. I was. You had dinner with Ava. It was after work. You told her you'd been looking forward to seeing her all week. We're friends. You called her beautiful. He didn't answer. You told Emily you were thinking about her. Silence. You told Rachel not to tell me something. Ethan looked toward the window like the answer might be waiting out there instead of sitting in his own phone. You sent heart emojis to women whose names I've never even heard. He suddenly threw both hands into the air. Because they're friends, Clara. I looked at him for several seconds before speaking again. No. My voice barely rose above a whisper. They're not. They are. No. He stepped closer. Men and women can be friends. I agree. His expression flickered. Then why are we arguing? Because that's not what this is. I unlocked the phone again. Friends don't secretly arrange dates while pretending to work late. I scrolled. Friends don't send messages saying they can't stop thinking about kissing each other. Another scroll. Friends don't hide 47 conversations from the person they live with. His eyes narrowed. 47? I counted. His face changed. Not because he was embarrassed. Because he realized I'd seen all of it. For the first time since I'd woken him up, genuine panic flashed across his face. He took one careful step toward me. Clara, listen. I'm listening. It isn't what it looks like. I almost laughed. There are sentences people say because they're true. And there are sentences people say because they need time to invent something better. This one belonged firmly in the second category. So tell me what it looks like. He hesitated. Then he said the 5 words that, strangely enough, hurt more than the messages themselves. That's different. You wouldn't understand. I searched his face, honestly expecting him to smile and admit he was joking. I wouldn't understand? No. He nodded quickly, as though he'd finally found solid ground. Women communicate differently. I frowned. What does that even mean? They're naturally more emotional. So? They flirt. I blinked. They compliment people. I continued staring at him. They use hearts and pet names. That's just how some women talk. And you? What about me? You answered every single message. I was being polite. You told one woman she looked incredible. I was encouraging her. You told another one you missed her. I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I couldn't believe this conversation was real. So when I text my cousin about a birthday present, he interrupted immediately. That's completely different. I laughed. This time I couldn't stop myself. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that escapes when your brain simply refuses to process the absurdity standing in front of you. You know what's fascinating? He looked confused. You've used that phrase twice tonight. What phrase? That's different. I took one slow breath. When I text my cousin, it's different. When you lie about working late to have dinner with another woman, it's different. When I have male coworkers, it's disrespectful. When you maintain 47 private conversations with women, they're just friends. He opened his mouth. I didn't let him speak. You made me block people who've loved me my entire life. My voice remained calm, but I could feel tears gathering despite my best efforts. My cousin didn't flirt with me. My coworkers never crossed a line. My friends respected our relationship. I held his phone out toward him, but the one person I trusted completely. I looked straight into his eyes. and he was secretly building 47 versions of himself for 47 different women. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Instead, he lowered his head and said quietly, "I never thought you'd find out." The sentence hung in the air between us. Not, "I never meant to hurt you." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I made a terrible mistake." Just, "I never thought you'd find out." And somehow that hurt more than every message I'd read combined. Because in that moment, I finally understood something I'd been refusing to see for a very long time. He hadn't been protecting our relationship. He'd been protecting his lies. And those are two very different things. For several long seconds, neither of us said anything. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed with his head lowered, while I remained exactly where I was, his phone still resting in my hand. The bedroom suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though I were standing inside someone else's home instead of the place I'd carefully built years before I ever met him. I kept waiting for him to say something that would make all of this feel less impossible. Not an excuse, not even an explanation, just one honest sentence. Instead, he let out a slow breath and looked at me with tired eyes. "Can we please sit down?" For a moment, I couldn't recognize the man sitting in front of me. "What for?" "So we can talk without screaming." "I'm not screaming." "No, but you're upset." I almost smiled. "You're right, I am upset." He nodded, as if we'd reached common ground. And people say things they don't mean when they're upset. I couldn't help noticing how carefully he chose every word. He still wasn't talking about what he'd done. He was talking about how I might react to what he'd done. That difference mattered. "I know exactly what I mean," I said quietly. "I don't think you do." I set his phone on the dresser between us. "I think you're hoping I don't." His jaw tightened. "Claire, relationships are complicated." "No." I shook my head. "People make them complicated." He rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. "I should have told you." "Yes." "I handled things badly." "Yes." "I never wanted to hurt you." For the first time since I'd woken him up, I believed part of what he was saying. Not because he sounded convincing. Because I genuinely thought he hadn't wanted me to feel pain. People like Ethan rarely plan to hurt someone. They simply expect the truth to stay hidden forever. When it doesn't, they're shocked that consequences exist. "So," I asked, "how long?" He looked at me. "How long what? How long have you been lying?" His eyes drifted toward the floor. "I don't know." "Try." "A few months." I unlocked his phone again. "The oldest conversation here is almost 11 months old." Silence. "So let's try again." He swallowed. "It wasn't serious then." "When did it become serious?" "I don't know." "You seem to say that a lot tonight." "I honestly don't." I nodded slowly. "I do." His eyebrows lifted. "I know exactly when it became serious." He frowned. "It became serious the moment you looked me in the eyes and asked me to build a relationship based on honesty while you were already living a lie." He didn't answer. "It became serious every time you kissed me goodbye before meeting someone else." Still nothing. "It became serious every single time you accused me of doing exactly what you were doing." He closed his eyes. "I know." "No." My voice remained calm. "You know now because you got caught." That sentence finally landed. His shoulders dropped. For the first time that night, he stopped trying to defend himself. Instead, he sat down heavily on the edge of the bed and covered his face with both hands. I messed everything up. I watched him quietly. There was a time when seeing him cry would have broken my heart. Now, it mostly made me tired, because I'd spent 2 years cleaning up emotional messes he created. Whenever he became insecure, I reassured him. Whenever he doubted me, I explained myself. Whenever he imagined problems, I apologized for things I'd never done. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember the last time he'd been the one comforting me. Love had slowly become a full-time job, and I'd been the only employee. After another minute, Ethan finally looked up. "I'll block them." The words hung in the air. "What?" "I'll delete everything." He reached toward the dresser. "I'll block every single one of them." I stepped between him and the phone. "No." He blinked. "I thought that's what you'd want." A sad laugh escaped before I could stop it. "You really don't understand." "I do." "No." "No, Ethan." I shook my head. "You think this is about contacts?" He looked confused. "It isn't." "I'll prove you can trust me." "You already had that chance." "I'll quit Instagram." "This isn't about Instagram." "I'll change my number." "This isn't about your phone." Frustration crept into his voice. "Then what do you want from me?" I answered without hesitation. "The truth." "I've been telling you the truth." "No." I looked directly into his eyes. "You've been telling me the smallest amount of truth necessary to keep me from asking the next question." His face fell. It was exactly what he'd been doing. "I need you to answer one thing honestly." "Okay." "When you asked me to block every man in my life," I paused. "Did you actually believe I was cheating?" He didn't respond. "Ethan!" Another long silence. Finally, almost too quietly to hear, he admitted, "No." The word hit harder than I'd expected. "So you knew?" "I knew you weren't cheating." "Then why?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I was scared." "Of what?" "That someone better would come along." I listened. He continued. You have your career. You own this place. You've always been stable. He gave a humorless laugh. I kept thinking that eventually you'd realize you deserve someone better. There it was. The insecurity I'd spent 2 years trying to heal. Only now I finally understood something important. His insecurity hadn't made him cheat. His insecurity had become the excuse he used to justify cheating. I thought, he continued quietly, if I could make you need me more. The sentence stopped halfway. He realized he'd said too much, but it was already out. If you could make me need you more. I repeated it slowly. Then maybe I wouldn't leave. He couldn't even look at me. The room fell completely silent. Every strange moment from the last 2 years suddenly rearranged itself inside my memory. The arguments whenever I made plans with friends. The guilt whenever I visited family. The complaints whenever I worked late. The endless questions. The suspicion. The pressure. It had never been random. Little by little, he'd been making my world smaller. Not because he loved me too much. Because smaller worlds are easier to control. I sat down in the chair beside the window. For the first time all night, I wasn't thinking about the women. Not Ava. Not Emily. Not the other 45 conversations. I was thinking about myself. About the woman I'd been before Ethan. The woman who laughed without checking whether someone else approved. The woman who never felt guilty for replying to a cousin. The woman who trusted her own instincts. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped listening to her. I'd started listening only to him. I have one last question, I said. He looked up immediately. Anything. Did any of those women know about me? He hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Some did. Some? A few. And the others? They thought... His voice disappeared. They thought what? And that I was single. I closed my eyes. Not because I wanted to cry. Because I needed one quiet second before making the decision I already knew was coming. When I opened them again, I felt strangely peaceful. Not happy. Not relieved. Just clear. Crystal clear. I stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled one of the empty suitcases onto the floor. The zipper echoed through the bedroom. Ethan stared at it. Clara. I met his eyes one final time. I think it's time you started packing. For a second, Ethan didn't move. He simply stared at the suitcase lying open on the floor as though he couldn't quite understand what he was looking at. Then he looked back at me. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. His eyes searched my face, probably looking for the version of me he'd become so used to over the last 2 years. The woman who softened after every argument, who apologized first just to end the tension, who convinced herself that love meant giving people one more chance. She wasn't standing in front of him anymore. Clara, he said carefully, it's 4 a.m. I know. Let's get some sleep. No. We'll talk tomorrow. We're talking now. His shoulders sagged. You always tell people not to make big decisions when they're emotional. I usually do. So why are you doing it now? Because this isn't an emotional decision. I looked around the bedroom we'd shared for almost a year. This decision has been forming for months. He frowned. What does that mean? It means tonight didn't destroy our relationship. I paused. It revealed that it had already been broken. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped himself. I could almost see him searching for a strategy that had worked before. Reason, charm, guilt, promises. One by one, he seemed to realize none of them fit anymore. Finally, he took a slow step toward me. I love you. The words landed between us with surprising emptiness. Not because I doubted he'd felt something for me. I think he did. But love without honesty eventually becomes something else. Possession, comfort, convenience, fear. Maybe a little of all four. I believe you think you do, I answered quietly. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means I think you loved having someone who forgave everything. His face fell. I wasn't using you. Weren't you? I gestured toward the phone on the dresser. You asked me to sacrifice people who had been in my life for years. I looked at him steadily. Meanwhile, you couldn't even give up conversations with women whose last names I don't know. Those conversations didn't mean anything. I almost smiled. If they didn't matter... I nodded toward the phone. Why hide them? He didn't answer. If they were innocent... Another pause. Why lie about them? Still nothing. If they weren't replacing what we had... I took a slow breath. Why were you giving them the same affection you were giving me? He ran both hands through his hair before sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. I don't know why I did it. No. I shook my head gently. I think you do. Silence. You just don't like the answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. After nearly a minute, he finally spoke. I liked how it made me feel. The honesty surprised me. In what way? He laughed bitterly. They admired me. I waited. They thought I was funny. Another pause. They needed me. He looked up. And every time someone flirted with me, his voice grew quieter. I felt important. The confession wasn't dramatic. There were no tears. No raised voices. Just a tired man finally admitting something he'd probably been hiding from himself as much as from me. I never planned for it to go this far. I believed that. Not because it excused anything. Because most betrayals don't begin with grand plans. They begin with tiny choices people convince themselves don't matter. One message, one compliment, one lunch, one secret, then another, and another, until eventually the lie grows so large that telling the truth would require tearing your entire life apart. So, I asked quietly, how many women did you actually meet? He closed his eyes. I don't know. Ethan. 5. I waited. He opened his eyes again. And 9? I kept looking at him. He sighed. 9. The room felt colder. And Ava? He didn't hesitate this time. Yes. You were sleeping with her. Another long silence. Then, yes. There it was. Not because I'd needed confirmation. I'd already known. But hearing the truth spoken out loud somehow made it irreversible. For almost 2 years, I'd trusted this man with every vulnerable part of my life. He knew about my father's heart attack. He sat beside me during my grandmother's funeral. He held me when I lost my job before finding a better one 6 weeks later. He knew which anniversary still made my mother cry. He knew why I hated thunderstorms after getting trapped in a flooded car as a teenager. I had given him stories I'd never told anyone else. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he'd been building entirely different relationships with other women. Not because I wasn't enough. Because he wanted more than one person believing he was everything. I walked to the bedroom window and looked down at the quiet street below. The city was beginning to wake. A delivery truck rolled through the intersection. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. Somewhere in another apartment, lights switched on one by one as people prepared for work. Life was continuing exactly as it always had. Mine had quietly split into 2 versions. The one before I unlocked Ethan's phone, and the one after. Behind me I heard him stand. I'll go to therapy. I didn't turn around. I mean it. Silence. I'll delete every account. More silence. I'll call every one of them. Still I said nothing. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. That finally made me look back. You can't. His eyes filled again. I can try. I shook my head slowly. No. He looked genuinely confused. Why not? Because you're talking like trust is something you rebuild by working harder. I held his gaze. It isn't. He waited. Trust is something people give willingly. I paused. And once they discover they've been handing it to someone who never protected it, I felt my throat tighten for the first time that night. They don't become stronger. They become careful. He lowered his head. I never wanted to make you afraid. You didn't, I answered honestly. You made me question myself. That sentence seemed to hurt him more than anything else I'd said. Because it was true. Cheating wounds your heart. Manipulation reaches much deeper. It teaches you not to trust your own instincts. To apologize for things that never happened. To mistake control for devotion. To confuse exhaustion with compromise. I wasn't afraid of Ethan anymore. I was grieving the version of myself that had spent 2 years believing every problem was somehow her responsibility. After another long silence, I walked over to the closet and placed the empty suitcase in front of him. You don't have to leave this minute. He looked up hopefully. But you are leaving. The hope disappeared. I'll stay with my mother for a few days. I think that's best. I'll come back this weekend so we can talk. No. His expression froze. There won't be another conversation. There will. I met his eyes calmly. It'll be about collecting the rest of your things. He swallowed hard. You've already decided. I nodded once. I decided the moment I realized you were asking me to prove my loyalty while secretly living like a single man. He closed the suitcase without putting anything inside. Then, almost in a whisper, he asked, When did you stop loving me? I looked at him for several seconds before answering. I don't think love disappeared tonight. A sad smile crossed my face. I think respect did. And once respect leaves, love rarely survives for very long. When the sun finally came up, neither of us had slept. The apartment was filled with that strange silence that only exists after something irreversible has happened. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet we'd once enjoyed on lazy Sunday mornings. This silence felt heavy, like every wall had heard too much and didn't know what to do with it. Ethan packed slowly. Not because he had that many things, because every shirt he folded felt like another confirmation that this wasn't an argument anymore. This was the end. I stayed in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold almost as soon as I'd poured it. I wasn't watching him pack, but every zipper closing and every drawer sliding shut echoed through the condo. For the first time in 2 years, I realized I wasn't wondering how to make things better. I was wondering how I'd ignored so much for so long. Around 8 that morning, Ethan carried his first suitcase into the hallway. He stopped at the front door. Can we at least tell people together? He asked quietly. I looked up from my coffee. What do you mean? I don't want everyone thinking I'm some terrible person. The irony almost made me laugh. Then maybe you should have thought about that before becoming one. He looked away. I made mistakes. No. I shook my head. Mistakes happen once. I met his eyes. You built an entire lifestyle around lying. He didn't argue. Because he couldn't. Instead, he quietly walked out the front door. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. His mother. Margaret Brooks. I stared at her name for a few seconds before answering. Hello? What on earth happened? Her voice wasn't angry. Not yet. It was the voice of someone convinced there had been a misunderstanding she could fix. Ethan's here, she continued. He says the two of you had a fight. We didn't have a fight. A short silence followed. Then what happened? I ended the relationship. Another pause. You ended over one argument? It wasn't one argument. Ethan said you went through his phone. I did. Clara, she sighed. That wasn't right. No, I agreed. It wasn't. For a brief second, I thought she understood. Then she continued. You violated his privacy. I closed my eyes. There it was, the conversation I'd expected. What would you have preferred? I asked calmly. That I trusted him. I did. Silence. For 2 years. She hesitated. Ethan admitted he'd been talking to some women. Talking? I almost laughed. He wasn't collecting pen pals. People say things online they don't mean. I read months of messages. He said nothing physical happened. I remembered Ava's conversation. The restaurant receipts. The hotel reservation confirmation I'd found buried inside his email. No, I answered quietly. He's lying to you too. The line fell completely silent. Finally, she asked, What do you want from him? It was a question I'd been asking myself all night. The surprising part was, I didn't want anything. No apology. No explanation. No revenge. I want him to leave. She exhaled slowly. People can change. They can. You don't believe Ethan can? I believe he can. She sounded relieved. But he won't change because I stayed. That sentence ended the conversation. 20 minutes later, Ethan texted me. I'm sorry. I looked at the message for a long time. Then another appeared. I know words aren't enough. Then, please don't block me. I stared at those 4 words. The same man who had watched me block my own cousin was now asking me not to block him. Life has a strange sense of humor. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my contacts. The blocked list. Nathan, my cousin. I tapped his name. Unblock. Then my old coworker. Unblock. My college friend. Unblock. One by one, I restored connections I'd severed for someone who had never deserved that kind of sacrifice. Finally, I opened my messages and typed to Nathan. I'm so sorry. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then his reply. I was hoping you'd text. Nothing more. No guilt. No lecture. No questions. Just relief. Tears finally came. Not because of Ethan. Because I'd spent months believing people would disappear if I disappointed them. The people who truly loved me never had. That afternoon, after Ethan texted that he had taken everything he needed for the week and would arrange a time to collect the rest, I called a locksmith and changed the locks. He wasn't on the deed, wasn't on a lease, and he had already left his key on the kitchen counter. Not because I thought Ethan would come back angry, because I needed one symbolic act that belonged entirely to me. As the locksmith worked, I walked through every room of the condo. The place looked almost the same. The couch hadn't moved. The photographs were still on the shelves. The coffee mug still hung beneath the cabinets. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow, everything felt different. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. For months, I'd walked past that mirror, wondering whether I was being unreasonable, whether I smiled too much at other men, whether replying to coworkers was disrespectful, whether I needed to become smaller to make someone else feel secure. The woman looking back at me wasn't perfect. She was exhausted, heartbroken, embarrassed. But for the first time in a very long while, she trusted herself again. Over the next few weeks, mutual friends slowly learned what had happened. Some reached out. Some disappeared. A few admitted they'd noticed Ethan flirting, but hadn't known how serious it had become. One message stood out more than the rest. It came from a woman whose name I recognized immediately. Ava. For several minutes, I debated whether to open it. Eventually, I did. The message was surprisingly short. Ava, I almost didn't message you, but after everything I found out yesterday, I couldn't stay quiet. He told me he'd been single for almost a year. I'm truly sorry. He told me he'd been single for almost a year. I'm truly sorry. I read it twice, then 3 times. There was no anger in her words, only embarrassment. I replied with a single sentence. Neither of us deserve to be lied to. She answered almost instantly. No, we didn't. That was the last conversation we ever had. A month passed. Then another. One Saturday morning, I found myself helping my aunt decorate for the birthday party that had started this entire chain of events. Nathan was there. So was the rest of my family. Nobody treated me differently. Nobody asked why I'd disappeared for a while. They simply hugged me as though I'd never left. At one point, Nathan nudged my shoulder. You okay? I smiled. I'm getting there. He nodded. That's enough. Standing there in a backyard full of people I'd almost cut out of my life, I realized something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Love should never require isolation. The people who truly love you don't ask you to shrink your world. They become part of it. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Ethan had started seeing someone new. For a brief moment, I wondered if he'd changed. Then I stopped myself. That question wasn't mine anymore. His future wasn't my responsibility. Neither were his choices. One evening, almost 6 months after we broke up, I found an old cardboard box while cleaning a closet. Inside was a framed photograph from our first vacation together. We were standing on a beach, sunburned and smiling, convinced we'd found forever. I looked at it for a long time. Then I smiled. Not because I missed him, because I finally understood something. The woman in that picture wasn't foolish for loving someone. She was simply loving the wrong person. I removed the photo from the frame, recycled the picture, and kept the frame. It was still perfectly good. It just deserved a better memory. Looking back now, people sometimes ask me what the biggest red flag was. Was it the lies? The cheating? The 47 conversations? The answer always surprises them. Number. The biggest red flag wasn't another woman. It was the day the man who claimed to love me asked me to disconnect from everyone else who did. In the end, the only person I removed was the one who deserved it.